Okay, so today we will be talking about arterial supply to the brain, and our emphasis will be on the circle of Willis, which is a major collateral circulation that supplies blood to the brain. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then we'll give a little introduction to what the circle of Willis is and what the blood supply to the brain looks like. So we would start with this slide. I'm going to share my screen. Share screen. Okay, let me put this on slideshow. Good. So arterial supply to the brain. Arterial supply to the brain. So you see this beautiful picture of the brain with blood vessels attached to it and showing the different areas or the different aspects of the brain that each of these blood vessels supply. Now, the arterial circulation to the brain involves a couple of blood vessels, and these blood vessels are branches of two main blood vessels. So this diagram here gives you an overview of what the blood supply to the brain is. And this diagram here is showing you exactly what the circle of Willis is. So the circle of Willis is actually a collateral, blood circulation to the brain. And it is made up of two main arteries, which I'm going to mention to you later. But from this diagram, you could see more than two arteries making up the circle of Willis. There are a lot of arteries here, maybe about 10 arteries, but the circle of Willis itself is formed by five main arteries, and I'm going to mention them for you. So this circle you see here, is what we call the circle of Willis, and the cerebral cortex of the brain receives blood supply from this circle of Willis. And the essence of the circle of Willis, which I might talk about more later, is so that when a blood vessel, when any of these blood vessels is occluded, maybe something happens to a particular artery, right? The other parts of the brain would not suffer from it. So that's why we have a collateral circulation, such that if there is an obstruction of this blood vessel here, blood can still get to this part of the brain through this other side. So that is why we have this arterial circle of Willis. So it is just a collateral blood circulation that makes sure that every part of the brain receives blood, even when there is an occlusion of an artery within the circle of Willis. Good. So the blood supply to the brain. Now, why is it important that we talk about the blood supply to the brain? It is because you know that the brain, number one, is one of the most important organs that we have in our body, and the brain controls everything that happens in the human body. And because of that, there is emphasis on the blood supply to the brain. Like I told you before in previous lectures, that without blood supply to your organs cannot function. So if the brain is that important, then it means that the blood supply to the brain should be as important also, because without blood reaching the brain, all brain cells will begin to die and they will no longer be able to function. And when brain cannot function and brain cells cannot function, then we can do nothing. We can do nothing. So that is why the blood supply to the brain is a very important topic of discussion. Now, if blood supply to the brain stops for just 10 seconds, blood supply to the brain stops for just 10 seconds, you would become unconscious. Now, the brain cells depend so much on blood supply that if something happens and there is no blood supply to the brain in 10 seconds, for just 10 seconds, you would become unconscious, you know. And then if blood supply to the brain continues for more than 10 seconds, if it continues, you know, there is continuous ischemia or lack of blood to the brain, it can lead to irreversible brain damage. So the brain cells will become damaged. Why? Because the brain cells, they work so hard and they depend on the oxygen and the nutrients from the blood for them to be able to function. And so once there is blood ischemia or stoppage of blood flow to the brain cells for more than 10 seconds, there would be irreversible brain damage. Now, when blood supply to the brain stops for up to 4 minutes, so for 4 minutes, no blood supply to the brain cells begin to damage. Now, when there is no blood supply for 10 seconds, you become unconscious. But when it goes beyond 10 seconds to 4 minutes, the brain cells begin to experience damage. And as 10 minutes, if you don't get blood supply for 10 minutes to your brain, there would be complete brain damage, irreversible brain damage. And that person is gone already, because once your brain cannot do anything, it means that you are dead. Why? Because your brain tells your heart to pump blood. Your brain, you know, tells your kidney to, you know, excrete urine. Your brain tells your liver. Everything that happens in your body, your brain has control of it. So your brain controls the autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, everything. So just imagine that for 10 minutes, your brain did not get blood supply and the cells begin to die and die completely. All the cells, the infarction of all brain cells, it means that your heart can no longer function. Breathing will be affected because the breathing center is in the medulla oblongata. So if that part is damaged, there will be no breathing. And once you cannot breathe, you are gone. The vascular center also in the brain. So once that part is affected and blood cannot get there, then it means that there will be no general blood circulation to even other organs of your body, and that means that life is over for you. So that is why blood supply to the brain is very important. Now, the brain consists of 2% of the total body, just 2% of the total body, but it receives 20% of the cardiac output. Remember, in our last lecture, we said that the coronary circulation takes about 5% of the cardiac output, right? 5% of the cardiac output, which is about 250 milliliters of blood going back to the heart through the coronary circulation. But the brain takes 20% of the cardiac output, not just 5%, 20% of the cardiac output. So it means that about, we said that 5% was 250 mils, yeah? So 20% would be times 4 of 250 mils, which would be 1,000. That would be 1 liter, actually, 1 liter. Yeah, that would be 1 liter of blood going back to going to the brain, because the cardiac output per minute we said is 5 liters. Yeah, 20% of it, which should be one fifth, yeah, is going to the brain. So you see how important the brain is. 1 liter out of 5 liters is taking blood, is going to the brain. Good. And then 20% of the total oxygen need in your body goes to the brain also, because of the enormous work that the brain does. So that is why blood supply to the brain is an important concept to be discussed. Now, so what are the arteries that supply blood to the brain? There are two sets of arteries. Two sets of arteries supply blood to the brain, and these arteries are a pair of the vertebral arteries, a pair of the vertebral arteries, and a pair of the internal carotid artery. If you remember, when we were talking about the aorta and the aortic arch, and the branches that come of artery that come out of the aortic arch, we mentioned the brachiocephalic trunk, we mentioned the subclavian artery, and we mentioned the common carotid artery, right? Now, and I also showed you the origin of the vertebral artery. So we said that on the right side, we have the common carotid artery. We have the common carotid artery. And then on the left side, we'll have the subclavian artery. And then from that subclavian artery, we have the vertebral artery. So that vertebral artery runs upward to go supply the brain, but I'm going to show you how it does that. And then the common carotid artery runs, superiorly also, and then splits into the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. But it is the internal carotid artery that goes to supply the brain. Good. So look at this diagram here. In this diagram, I'm going to show you the vertebral artery. So here you find the vertebral artery, and this is another vertebral artery, the right and left vertebral arteries. Now, these two vertebral arteries, which we said came from the from the subclavian artery, that these arteries, this vertebral artery, come together and form an artery that is called the basilar artery. So pay attention. Two vertebral artery, left and right vertebral artery, come together and form the basilar artery. So this basilar artery goes up and then gives rise to different branches. Okay, you see different branches, but our emphasis would be on the posterior cerebral artery, because the posterior cerebral artery is part of the circle of Willis. So our emphasis will be on that. But this artery here is called the basilar artery, this big one. But how was it formed? It was formed from the vertebral artery. So we said that two sets of arteries form the circle of Willis, form blood supply to the brain, two sets of arteries. And the two sets of arteries we said are a pair of vertebral artery, which is this right and left vertebral artery, this one and this one. And then a pair of internal carotid arteries. But in this diagram, you find the vertebral artery coming together to form a basilar artery. So the basilar artery gives off different branches and then comes to form the posterior cerebral artery, which is part of the circle of Willis. So what are the branches of the basilar artery? But remember, basilar artery is coming from where? From vertebral artery. The basilar artery is formed from the pair of vertebral artery, which are coming from the aortic arch and the subclavian artery. Now, the branches of the basilar artery are the Pontine arteries, But we're not going to pay attention to these Pontine arteries because our focus is on the circle of Willis. So the Pontine arteries are not part of the circle of Willis, but they supply the pons. Yeah, the part of the brain, this part of the brain called the pons. So you see these little branches coming out here. They are supplying the pons. This part of the brain is the pons. So they are going to supply. So they are called Pontine artery. Then we'll have the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. So here you find the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, but they are not also part of the circle of Willis. Okay, and then we'll have the Labyrinthine Artery, and then we'll have the superior cerebellar artery, which is not also part of the circle of Willis. Here you find the superior cerebellar arteries, and then we'll have the posterior cerebral artery. So this one is important to us because this one forms part of the circle of Willis, posterior cerebral arteries. Now, we have said that the basilar artery has these 5 branches, but out of these 5 branches, only one, called the posterior cerebral artery, takes part in the circle of Willis. The posterior cerebral artery takes part in the circle of Willis. And remember where it is coming from. It is coming from the basilar artery, and the basilar artery is coming from the vertebral artery. So vertebral artery from basilar artery. Basilar artery gives rise to these 5 branches, but of these 5, the most important one to us is the posterior cerebral artery because it is part of the circle of Willis. And this posterior cerebral artery, you find it here. That is this one here. So you have the posterior cerebral artery here, and you have the posterior cerebral artery here on both sides. Good. Now, let's look at the internal carotid artery. Don't forget, 2 sets of arteries form the blood supply to the brain, 2 sets of arteries. And those 2 sets of arteries are a pair of the vertebral artery, the right and left vertebral artery, which form the basilar artery, okay? And then a pair of the internal carotid artery. And we said the internal carotid artery comes from the common carotid artery, which comes from the arch of the aorta, okay? Or maybe from the brachiocephalic trunk, depending on if we are talking on the right or the left side. Now, what are the branches of the internal carotid artery, and which of them plays a role or forms part of the circle of Willis? So the first branch of the internal carotid artery is the ophthalmic artery. The ophthalmic artery. From the name, you know it is going to supply the eyes, okay? Ophthalmic artery. Now, we also have the posterior communicating artery, the posterior communicating artery. Now, this posterior communicating artery is part of the circle of Willis, but the ophthalmic artery is not actually part of the circle of Willis, okay? But the posterior communicating artery is part of the circle of Willis. And then we have the anterior choroidal artery. And then we have the anterior cerebral artery. This anterior cerebral artery is part of the circle of Willis. And then the middle cerebral artery is part of the circle of Willis. And then we have the hypophyseal arteries, which are not part of the circle of Willis, because the hypophyseal arteries are going to supply the hypophysis, okay, or the pituitary gland. Now, what are the 3 arteries from the internal carotid artery that are part of the circle of Willis? They are anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and the posterior communicating artery. So remember this. You could be asking an exam, what branches of the internal carotid artery forms part of the circle of Willis? So they are anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and posterior communicating artery. Which part of the basilar artery forms the circle of Willis? We said it's what? The posterior artery. So that is 4 arteries I have mentioned that form the circle of Willis. But actually, there are 5 arteries that form the circle of Willis. 5. Don't misunderstand this. I said earlier that blood supply to the brain generally is from 2 sets of arteries, which are the 2 vertebral arteries, which from the basilar artery, and the 2 internal carotid artery. Okay? But for circle of Willis alone, I'm not talking about blood supply to the entire brain. I'm just talking about the circle of Willis. For the circle of Willis alone, there are 5 arteries that form the circle of Willis. And these 5 arteries are the posterior cerebral artery, which is a branch of the basilar artery, and the posterior communicating artery, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery, the anterior cerebral artery, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery, the medial cerebral artery, which is also a branch of the internal carotid artery, and one more artery. So that one more artery is called the anterior communicating artery. Now, I'm going to show you where that is. So let's look at this diagram. In this diagram, this place here, this is the anterior communicating artery. Now, because the anterior communicating artery joins the 2 anterior cerebral arteries. So these 2 here are the anterior cerebral arteries, which are branches of the internal carotid artery. So this is anterior cerebral artery. Both of them are joined by an artery here called the anterior communicating artery. So that is the 5th artery that forms the circle of Willis, because this is the circle of Willis, and this artery is part of it. This anterior communicating artery, they come from the anterior cerebral artery, so they join both of them together. So let's mention the 5 arteries that make up the circle of Willis. We'll start with, let's look at this diagram. So you said what? Posterior cerebral artery, right? So posterior cerebral artery here, and then we have the posterior communicating artery. So this is posterior communicating artery, which is joining the posterior cerebral artery and the middle cerebral artery. Okay, that is the posterior cerebral artery. And then the 3rd artery will be the middle cerebral artery. And then also we have the anterior cerebral artery, which is the 4th artery. And then we have the 5th artery, which is the anterior communicating artery. So these are the 5 arteries that form the circle of Willis. But of the 5 arteries, 3 of them are from the internal carotid artery. What are they? Posterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, and middle cerebral artery. So here you see the middle cerebral artery here, which is a branch of the internal carotid artery. So here you see internal carotid artery giving rise to middle cerebral artery. This same internal carotid artery gave rise to this posterior communicating artery, and then also gave rise to the anterior cerebral artery. This internal carotid artery gave rise to the anterior cerebral artery, and the anterior cerebral arteries are joined by this anterior communicating artery. Let me see if I can get a better diagram. Yeah, so let's look at the diagram. Okay, now this diagram here, let's identify the 5 arteries from this diagram. This is the beta diagram. Now, from this diagram, you will see first, this is the internal carotid artery, because we said blood supply to the brain is from the internal carotid artery, the 2 internal carotid artery, and then the 2 vertebral artery, which will form this basilar artery. Okay, but for the circle of Willis, we have the 5 main arteries that form the circle. So this is the circle, and the 5 main arteries that form this circle are anterior cerebral artery, which is a branch of the internal carotid. So this is internal carotid. You see, gave branch to this anterior cerebral artery. So these two anterior cerebral arteries are branches of internal carotid artery. Then we have the anterior communicating artery, which joins the two anterior cerebral artery. But these anterior communicating arteries are extensions of the anterior cerebral. Okay. Then we have the middle cerebral artery, which is the branch of the internal carotid artery. So internal carotid artery forms this middle cerebral artery. And then we also have, from this internal carotid artery, we also have a posterior communicating artery. So internal carotid artery gives us posterior communicating artery, middle cerebral artery, and anterior cerebral artery. Then we have the anterior communicating artery here. Then on the posterior side, we have on the inferior side, we have the posterior cerebral artery, which is coming from the basilar artery, the branch of the basilar artery. And the basilar artery is coming from the vertebral arteries, which you cannot see in this diagram. So this is the circle of Willis, made up of 5 main blood vessels. Okay, let's go back and see. But remember that the internal carotid artery has other branches that are not part of the circle of Willis. That is why I put them in this slide. So ophthalmic artery, you can see anterior choroidal artery and hypophyseal artery. They are not part of the circle of Willis. Okay. So here, this diagram simply shows you where the internal carotid artery originates from. Now, here you will find this is the common carotid artery. This one is the common carotid artery. At this point, it bifurcates to form the internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. So this internal carotid artery is what goes in, enters into the skull, and then forms part of the circle of Willis that supply the brain. You can see why you see that the external carotid artery is supplying outside the face and other parts of the head, but the one going to the brain is the internal carotid artery. Okay, so it passes through the cavernous sinus and enters into the brain. Good. So here, this diagram is simply showing you the internal carotid artery, how it enters the brain. It passes through what we call the carotid canal here. You find the carotid canal here. That's where it passes into the cranium of the brain and also passes through the foramen lacerum. Then the vertebral artery, which is coming from the inferior aspect, passes through this foramen magnum into the cranial cavity to be able to get to the brain itself. Good. So here again is another diagram of the circle of Willis, showing the inferior view of the circle of Willis. So here you would find your basilar artery, and this basilar artery, you see, it gave rise to the posterior cerebral artery, and then the posterior cerebral artery is joined to the middle cerebral artery through the posterior communicating artery, this one. And then on this side, you will find the anterior cerebral artery, joined by the anterior communicating artery. So these are the arteries that form the circle of Willis. So the circle of Willis is also called the circulus arteriosus. Now, the circle of Willis is made up of, as we've already said, anteriorly, it is made up of the anterior communicating artery and the anterior cerebral artery, which I already showed you in the diagram. So anteriorly, It is made up of the anterior communicating artery and the anterior cerebral arteries. Posteriorly, it is made up of the basilar artery, dividing into two posterior cerebral arteries, which we saw in the previous diagram. And then on the lateral side, laterally on either side, we have the posterior communicating artery, which connects the internal carotid artery with the posterior cerebral artery. So these are the blood vessels that make up the circle of Willis. So we said that posteriorly, we have the basilar artery giving rise to the two posterior cerebral arteries. So posteriorly, the circle of Willis is made up of the two posterior cerebral arteries and the two posterior communicating arteries, which joins them to the middle carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. Then we said that anteriorly, we have the two anterior cerebral arteries that are joined by the anterior communicating artery. And laterally, we have this posterior communicating artery that join these two together. Good. So what is the function of the circle of Willis? Now, the function of the circle of Willis is to equalize blood flow to different parts of the brain. To equalize blood flow to different parts of the brain. That is the function of the circle of Willis, to equalize blood flow to different parts of the brain. Now, there is little interchange of blood across right and left half due to equality of blood pressure. So only very little interchange of blood from the right side to the left side, because you have almost equal number of blood vessels on both sides. So there is an equality of blood pressure. So the blood does not move from one side to the other side. Now, in case of occlusion, what I told you earlier, when there is an occlusion, the circle of Willis will act as principal collateral channel, so that when you block one part, you block one, let's say there's an occlusion in this blood vessel here, blood can still get to the anterior cerebral artery from this side. So blood can still come from this side and get to the anterior cerebral artery if we block here. Now, if the internal carotid artery is blocked on this side, right, blood will not, on the left side, blood will not be able to get to the anterior cerebral artery, if not for this collateral circulation, this circle of Willis, because blood can still come from here, and still get to the anterior cerebral artery, even though here was blocked. So that is the essence of the circle of Willis. So this diagram here will show you the different lobes, right, of the brain, of the cerebral cortex, different lobes of the cerebral cortex. And because we're going to look at how the circle of Willis, the branches of the circle of Willis supply each of these regions of the brain. So here you will find the occipital lobe of the brain, occipital lobe of the brain you will find here. And the junction between here, you find the parietal lobe of the brain. And the junction between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe will have a sulcus here, which we call the parieto-occipital sulcus. Remember that every lobe of the brain has a specific function. Don't forget that. Every lobe of the brain has a specific function. The occipital lobe has its own function. For example, the occipital lobe controls vision, okay? Now, the temporal lobe has its own function. Here you find the temporal lobe, it has its own function. The frontal lobe has its own function. Here you find what we call the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Precentral gyrus controls motor function, all movements, motor function, the primary motor cortex. And then here you have the sensory cortex. So here controls movement, motor function. Here controls sensation, okay? Sensory cortex. So what it means is that if blood supply to any of these lobes is blocked, if there's an occlusion, so the blood supply to any of these lobes, that area, that part of the brain can no longer function properly, because the cells, the brain cells, will begin to suffer ischemia, will suffer shock, blood will not get to them, and they will begin to do suffer what we call necrosis, or an infarction would happen, and these cells die. The brain cells begin to die, and when they die, they can no longer function. So if, for example, blood supply is obstructed to the occipital lobe, you will lose your vision. You can no longer see properly. When the precentral gyrus or the frontal lobe, any part of the brain that controls motor function, is deprived of blood supply, you lose your movement. You will not be able to move a certain part of your body. Okay, so depending on which hemisphere of the brain this is happening, because the cerebral cortex has two hemispheres. This one is showing you just one hemisphere. So this is a sagittal view of the cerebral cortex. Now, if blood supply to any of this region is affected, that region will lose its function. So don't forget these, because I'm going to show you how each of these arteries, anterior cerebral artery, the medial cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery, which part of this brain do they supply, and what will happen when there is an obstruction to blood supply. Good. So now from this diagram, you see the superolateral surface. Here, this place, this whole place in pink, most of the surface, superolateral surface of the brain, this part you see in pink shows you the part that is supplied by the medial cerebral artery. So the medial cerebral artery supplies all of these parts of the brain. So it supplies all of these. The parietal lobe, part of the parietal lobe is supplied by this medial cerebral artery. And then the temporal lobe here is supplied by the medial cerebral artery. A little part of the frontal lobe, is supplied also. So but let's look at it. Now, from the diagram, this pink part shows you where the medial cerebral artery supplies. So a small strip, about 2.5 centimeters along the superomedial border up to the parietal occipital sulcus, up to this place. This is parietal occipital sulcus here. So all of this place is supplied by the medial cerebral artery, and it stops here, this sulcus here. That is why you see that this whole occipital region has a different color. So it is not supplied by the medial cerebral. Medial cerebral only supplies this whole place. And then the anterior cerebral artery. So the anterior cerebral artery, sorry, excuse me. I made a mistake. Let me correct that. Most of this surface, this two-third, this whole place you see here is supplied by the medial cerebral artery, while the anterior cerebral artery supplies this whole surface, this superomedial border, this whole place with blue color is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Everything blue here. This is a part of the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, superior border, down to the junction between this parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. This junction here, that is where the, sorry, 1 minute. Yeah, so that is where the anterior cerebral artery supplies. Then the medial cerebral artery supplies 2/3 of this whole surface that is in pink color. And then the posterior cerebral artery, which is green, supplies the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe, this is the occipital lobe, if you did anatomy, is here. And the inferior part of the temporal lobe. So this green color came this way also. So this is the temporal lobe. The inferior part of the temporal lobe is also supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. But you can see that the bulk of the posterior cerebral artery is supplying the occipital lobe. So don't forget that. Now, how do you remember this? Medial cerebral artery is supplying this whole temporal lobe, some part of the parietal lobe, and a little part of the frontal lobe. Then the anterior cerebral artery is supplying the superomedial aspect of the parietal lobe, and then the posterior cerebral artery supplies the occipital lobe and the inferior part of the temporal lobe. So what will happen now? Let's look at this. Imagine, look at this region here, this place that is circled in of blue, I would say, and then this place that is circled in pink, and this place that is circled in green. So this place circled in green is the occipital region, okay? So we said it is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, and this controls vision, like I told you before. So if anything happens to the posterior cerebral artery, that would, outside the circle of Willis, that would affect the visual cortex and will affect your vision. If anything happens to this middle cerebral artery that supplies this whole place, then it will affect all the functions that are here. So here, this place, this is the frontal lobe, the inferior part of the frontal lobe. It has a region we call the Broca's region, Broca's area. So this Broca's area controls speech, okay? The speech area, it's called Broca's speech area. Now, when blood supply to the middle cerebral artery is occluded, it means that this Broca's region will no longer be able to receive blood, and that will lead to what we call, it means that the Broca area cannot function, and that will lead to what we call Broca's aphasia, Broca's aphasia, so inability to articulate speech. You will not be able to speak properly. Then here we have the Wernicke's receptive area. So this Wernicke's area, also affects you are not able to understand spoken speech. You cannot receive speech. So you have what is called Wernicke's aphasia. So if blood supply to this part is affected, you have Wernicke's receptive defect or Wernicke's aphasia. That is what happened. Then here you have the primary auditory area in the temporal lobe. So if blood supply to this temporal lobe is affected, what will happen? You will not be able to hear very well because that is where the auditory area is. The blood supply to this precentral gyrus or the primary motor area is affected. You will not be able to move very well. You would have some kind of paralysis or hemiparesis. Now, if there is a blood supply to this sensory area, somatosensory area is affected, it will affect different type of sensation. You will not be able to get them. So what will happen now if there is occlusion of the middle cerebral artery? So this is the middle cerebral artery. What will happen if there is occlusion to it? So from this diagram, we say the middle cerebral artery is this one in pink that supplies this whole region. It supplies the Broca's area, supplies the Wernicke's area, and supply some part of the primary motor area. So what will happen if there is an occlusion of this middle cerebral artery that supplies this whole place? So first thing, you will have what is called contralateral hemiplegia. Contralateral hemiplegia. So a certain part of your body, just one part of your body, will not be able to move. So maybe you'll not be able to move your right arm or your right leg. If it was the left hemisphere that had a block of the middle cerebral artery. So a block in the middle cerebral artery on the left hemisphere will lead to hemiplegia on the right side. So the right part of your body will not be able to move properly, okay? So, and then you will also not be able to receive sensation, hemi-anesthesia, because I told you that this part here it controls all sensation. So you'll not be able to get sensation on a half part of your body, on the contralateral. So contralateral means on the opposite side. So if the damage is to the left side of the brain, you won't be able to move the right part of your body, and you'll not be able to get sensation on the right part of your body. Why? Because the middle cerebral arteries supply the primary motor area and the sensory area. What will happen if the middle cerebral artery is occluded? You also have what is called aphasia, which I said before. So there will be loss of speech. That is what we call the Broca's aphasia, which is this region, Broca's region, because the middle cerebral artery supplies it also. So if there is occlusion to the middle cerebral artery, you will have Broca's aphasia. You will not be able to talk, and you will not also be able to understand spoken language. Good. Then we also have what is called the contralateral homonymous hemianopia. So this will have to do with your vision. You will not be able to, you'll lose vision on half side. Why? Because there's something called the optic radiation, which is also supplied by the middle cerebral artery. So once that does not receive blood, you have a kind of partial vision. Now, on this diagram, we'll look at the medial surface. So this is the medial surface of the cerebrum. You would see that most of the medial surface up to the parietal occipital sulcus, most of the medial surface, this is the medial surface, most of it is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. So this whole place like this in light blue color is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. And then we have the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe here, this pink one. This is the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe is supplied by the middle cerebral artery. The same thing we said in the other diagram we saw. And then the rest of the temporal lobe from here down to the occipital lobe are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So don't forget the medial surface of the cerebral cortex, all of this region supplied by the anterior cerebral artery, temporal lobe supplied by middle cerebral artery, then a part of the temporal lobe, and all parts of the occipital lobe are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery in green color. So let's see what will happen if there is a damage to any of them. Again, almost the same thing we said before. Here you see this blue color. So we said that the anterior cerebral artery supplies this blue color, this whole blue color. And that is where you have your primary motor area and your somatosensory area. So if there's an occlusion to this anterior cerebral artery, it means that blood will not get to your primary motor area and movement will be affected, and somatosensory sensations will be affected also. Now, let's see, occlusion of anterior cerebral artery will lead to the following: contralateral hemiparesis, the same thing we said before. Contralateral hemiparesis, because this motor area will be affected. So if this is the left hemisphere of the brain, the hemiparesis will be on the right side of the body, okay, and vice versa. Good. And then there will be inability to identify objects correctly because the superior parietal lobe controls your ability to identify objects. So this whole place is the parietal lobe, superior parietal lobe, you know. So, and it is also supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Then you will have apathy and personality changes, which are controlled by the frontal lobe. So when blood does not reach this frontal lobe, you see this is the anterior cerebral artery. You can see it here. Anterior cerebral artery is supplying the whole of the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe up to these points. All these places are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. So if anything happens with anterior cerebral artery, you will lose some functions of the frontal lobe, you will lose functions of the parietal lobe, you lose motor function, you lose somatosensory functions also. Good. Then this is posterior cerebral artery. We're going to come to this. Now, on the inferior aspect, what happens is that this is showing the inferior aspect of the cerebral cortex. So this whole region, most of the inferior, most of the inferior surface, except the temporal lobe, are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So these show the inferior surface of the cerebral cortex, inferior surface. Most of it are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery. Then, here you will see it, posterior, let me see what we have. Posterior cerebral artery, this is posterior cerebral artery here. We see all of these branches are coming from the posterior cerebral artery. So this supply the inferior aspect of the cerebral cortex. Then the temporal pole plus the lateral part of the orbital surface of the frontal lobe are supplied by the middle cerebral artery, which we already talked about in the previous diagram. But this place is showing you just the inferior surface. And then we have the medial part of the orbital surface of the frontal lobe is supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Anterior cerebral artery, you see it here, with the medial aspects of the orbital surface. Now, this is it here. So this is the frontal lobe. A part of that frontal lobe, the medial aspect of the inferior aspect of the frontal orbital surface of the frontal lobe is supplied by anterior cerebral artery. But now let's look at this. Look at this artery here. This artery in blue color. Look at, where is it? Yeah, so you see this whole region here is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. This whole region supplied by the posterior cerebral artery, because we said this is the occipital region. So the occipital region and parts of the inferior aspect of the temporal lobe are all supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So what will happen? Occlusion of the posterior cerebral artery will lead to contralateral homonymous hemianopia. So your vision will be affected. Why? Because we said that the visual cortex is in the occipital region, and it is the posterior cerebral artery that supplies the occipital lobe. So that is why you will have hemianopia there. Good. So this is what will happen when each of the blood vessels of the circle of Willis are affected. Quickly, we'll do a quick revision, a very quick revision. Now, the circle of Willis is made up of 5 blood vessels. They are anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, and anterior communicating artery. Now, each of those blood vessels we just mentioned, the most important one are the anterior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. the two communicating arteries are just to join different arteries together, but the most important ones are the anterior cerebral artery, medial cerebral artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. And what you need to know is that the anterior cerebral artery supplies the parietal lobe, and little part of the and part of the frontal lobe. So the whole parietal lobe and frontal lobe are supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Then the middle cerebral artery supplies the temporal lobe, but not the whole part, the parts of the temporal lobe. And then some part of the temporal lobe and all of the occipital lobe are supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. So what will happen if there is a problem or there is an occlusion of the posterior cerebral artery outside the circle of Willis? If there's an obstruction to the posterior cerebral artery, or vision will be affected. Your vision will be affected because the occipital lobe controls vision. If there is an occlusion of the middle cerebral artery, the temporal lobe will be affected because the temporal lobe has auditory functions. You'll not be able to hear very well, okay? And then the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe has several functions. And in this parietal lobe, you have the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory area. So it means that if anything happens to blood supply, so the anterior cerebral artery, there will be occlusion. If there's an occlusion, it means that the motor area will not be able to function and the somatosensory area will not be able to function. So you could have hemiplegia, hemiparesis, and you could have hemianesthesia. You'll not be able to get feelings. You're not able to feel sensations also. And then we talked about the Broca's speech area also. Talk about the Broca's speech area and the Wernicke's area that will also be affected if there is lack of blood supply. There's an occlusion of the middle cerebral artery, because we said the middle cerebral artery supplies most parts of the temporal lobe. So here, so this is the middle cerebral artery, supply most parts of the temporal lobe and some parts of the parietal lobe, but the occipital lobe is by the posterior cerebral artery, and a little part of the temporal lobe also supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. And then the anterior cerebral artery supplies the superior aspect, superolateral surface, where you have your parietal lobe, and some part of the frontal lobe supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Then these are all the lobes of the brain we talked about before: the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe, and then the occipital lobe. So blood occlusion to posterior cerebral artery will affect vision here. Occlusion to anterior cerebral artery will affect motor function and sensory, somatosensory functions. Occlusion to frontal lobe will affect motor functions also, and many other functions. Obstruction to blood flow to the temporal lobe will affect auditory functions. Good. So the circle of Willis is a very interesting topic because of the importance of blood supply to the brain. And we have already mentioned all the blood vessels that form the circle of Willis. Good. So do you have any question?
No, sir.
Okay, there's no question. Now, there are a lot of things you need to remember, and the main ones are the 5 main arteries that form the circle of Willis, and then know where they are coming from, their origin. So the origin, we said, are the vertebral arteries and the internal carotid arteries. Okay, so the internal carotid artery that comes from the common carotid artery, while the vertebral artery form the basilar artery that gives rise to the posterior cerebral artery, and all of these form the circle of Willis. Okay, that will be that for that will be